key headline on today's Times was this story that Liz Truss will declare, is planning to declare, that China is an official national security threat for the first time. This is an extraordinary turnaround from the days of David Cameron, when essentially there was this thing called Project Kowtow, when literally he and George Osborne would do anything to curry Chinese favour, so much so that we even let them finance a nuclear power station here in the United Kingdom. Is that smart? Really? Well, let's talk now to Philip Ingram, former senior military intelligence officer. Philip, thank you for joining me on Tice Talk this afternoon. And you have obviously, studied these sort of things for a very long time. I spoke actually a couple of months back, about a sort of emerging axis of the East that I actually called China, a sort of combination between China and Russia. And this was in a sense, the risk of them trading together on matters such as energy, and that you therefore end up with a sort of a Western axis and an Eastern axis. But this is quite a significant change from a potential Conservative leader, isn't it?
It is, but I think it's a timely change. It needs to be made as a very clear statement. China is growing in power across the world. It's planning things in multi-generational timeframes because Xi Jinping can think 25 years ahead. And it's slowly but surely getting its tentacles throughout all of our societies. And it's been doing that for quite a while. And we have been blind to it.
We really have. I mean, this sort of Belt and Road Initiative that we know China has been progressing in, for example, some African countries. But the truth is they've actually been developing that here in the United Kingdom, haven't they, with funding the Confucius Institutes, funding research groups, funding departments in universities. I mean, I think we've been completely naive over many, many years.
Oh, they have. They've been doing it here. They've been doing it throughout Europe. They've been doing it throughout the United States. They own many of the mines in Australia. They're doing it across the globe very slowly, very carefully. And their motivation is the interesting bit. It's economic. What they're trying to do is become a global economic powerhouse, and they're using the whole of their state infrastructure to do that. So they'll use their military influence. They'll use their political influence. They'll use their cyber teams, to do anything that they can to try and progress China from an economic perspective.
And of course, that's the key difference, isn't it, between China and Russia? Russia's shown that actually they like to use force and military intervention, whereas China uses economic might, but also economic leverage, in that people then become dependent on Chinese money in all different walks of life. So there's a big difference between things that are of sort of matters of critical interest, critical national security, national infrastructure, and having a trading relationship with China with our eyes open, where for goods and things that are not critical, that we're not dependent on. What I'm really struck by, though, Philip, is the number of companies now that are de-risking themselves from China as a single supplier nation.
And I think that's essential. I think the whole COVID crisis showed that where we were getting the majority of our PPE and everything else from China as a single supplier, it's wrong. We need to bring manufacturing back in countries so that if there is crisis and a global crisis, we can actually look after ourselves first and foremost. China is, it's interesting, you mentioned Russia and Ukraine. China is sitting on the fence still as to whether to support Russia or not to support Russia over Ukraine. But it's doing that, I think, because what it's going to try and do is buy Russia effectively. As Russia needs foreign currencies, it needs to export goods. China will facilitate that into India, Pakistan, and into China itself, because it is energy hungry and will do that. But China, whilst it's doing everything economically, is also growing militarily. They're producing about the equivalent of the Royal Navy every year in new ships. Most of these ships are now blue water, what are called blue water ships. So they're designed to power project, take Chinese power and put it somewhere else. That's not a nation that's sitting still and just looking inward. They're increasingly looking more and more outward. And that's what we should be very, very worried about.
And you raise that point about essentially China making Russia dependent again economically on Chinese money, China buying Russian gas, Russian coal, because obviously China is so energy hungry. But my fear about that, Philip, is that makes it much less needy for Russia to sell its gas to the West, and that's the key thing, is that therefore Russia's less likely to turn the gas taps back on to the west, because it's going to keep it for the east.
It is, but I don't see why we should be continuing to fund Putin's war in Ukraine by buying Russia's gas. Yes, it's painful. It's going to be very painful for us. But when people are feeling cold and suffering the pain, that's nothing compared to what the people in Ukraine are suffering. We're almost in the effects of the Ukraine war are happening across the globe, and that's go back to the Second World War, and we're not suffering the same physical effects that there were of explosive devices being dropped on our cities, but we're in a global conflict at the moment.
Well, I think that's right, but an interesting tweet has just come in here, Philip. I live in Scotland. What's with the TalkTV's China bashing? I live in Scotland and trust the Chinese and respect them more than the planks running Scotland. I mean,
well, that says more about the Scottish government than it does the Chinese.
I think that's absolutely right. Look, we're not bashing China. What we're saying is you've got to be aware of what are their objectives as a sovereign nation, and what are our objectives. And the two they can work together, but not on items of national security.
Yeah, well, exactly, and it's wider pieces. The whole issue around Hong Kong was more around China taking control of where US pension tax dollars were invested, because they were moved out of Shanghai, the Shanghai Stock Exchange, whenever President Trump banned investment into China. It was moved into the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. So China changes the rules and brings Hong Kong from being a separate entity into China. It regains control of US tax dollars. It's a way of putting pressure. They're doing this all of the time in different parts of the world. They are a big threat, and we need to watch them closely. That doesn't mean to say that there's automatically going to be conflict, but we need to recognise them as a threat.
The truth is, they think long term. They're equivalent of our civil servants. They're smart, they're competent, and regrettably, we've thought far too short term. Philip, thank you so much for your thoughts on China. That's Philip Ingram MBE, former senior military intelligence officer. Really interesting that.